this isn't the first period in American history when inequality has soared, when a very narrow stratum of people at the top have grown richer and richer and richer, while the mass of people find higher unemployment, reduced wages, in this period a slashed safety net. That was what was going on during the Gilded Age, for example. That was what was going on during the Roaring Twenties. That, in fact, is a kind of default position of American politics. In the absence of movements from below, of real trouble from below, in the absence of protest, American politics, electoral politics, despite the fact that so many people go out to vote, reverts to a position where big money is the dominating force. And when big money is the dominating force, regulations of business become impossible or they are ignored. And that, of course, is what happened in the current period. So the last big movement in American history was the civil rights movement, Black freedom movement. That movement subsided in the 70s, and it wasn't a coincidence that it was in the 1970s that business began to organize to take over American politics, including what we call electoral politics, including the Congress of the United States, the presidency, the parties, and so on. And so it's been time for another surge from the bottom for quite a while, and some of us have been waiting. Everybody in the society, in a rich society, why not everyone should have a kind of guaranteed income. It doesn't have to be lavish. It should probably be adequate to provide the necessities of life. And if everybody had such a basic income, we would overcome the intricacies, complexities, and gaps in coverage that characterize the present system of complex but inadequate programs. So it has the advantage of a kind of bold simplicity. Bold simplicity with a powerful idea behind it. The idea that a rich community society should guarantee income security to its members. But I think there are more powerful reasons than a good design for basic income, that we should credit basic income and pay attention to it now. And those more powerful reasons have to do with deep and irreversible changes in our societies, which make basic income very, very rational. What are those changes? Well, perhaps the most important is the spread of automation, together with the expansion of labor markets.
Welcome, welcome, welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. Poor People's Movements by Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward is a classic and provocative 1977 study of four major protest movements among the poor and oppressed in 20th century America. Included in the book are case studies of the Great Depression, mobilization of the unemployed, the struggles of the fledgling trade union movement of the same period, the civil rights movement of the 60s, and the welfare rights movement of the 60s and early 70s. Stressing both strategy and theory, they asked the key question of whether the poor fared best by participating in consensus building, conventional electoral politics, or by engaging in mass defiance, dissensus, and disruptive protest movements. They argue that these two strategies can help us understand why these movements succeed and how they fail. For Piven and Cloward, working within the system is often misplaced since it's rigged by elites against the poor. What's needed is a sense of crisis that will force change. Their ideas have been in the forefront in today's rise of a useful radical left through Occupy, Democratic Socialists, Our Revolution, Momentum, Jacobin Magazine, the Sunset Movement, AOC, the Squad, and the Green New Deal, among others. Frances is a distinguished professor of political science and sociologist emeritus at the Graduate Center, CUNY, CUNY. Her articles with Richard Cloward in The Nation in the 60s and 70s is widely credited with stimulating the formation of the National Welfare Rights Organization, a grassroots protest movement of welfare recipients. Her latest book is Challenging Authority: How Ordinary People Change America. Today in the Radical Imagination, we have a long-needed and long-awaited dialogue between Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove and Frances Fox Piven. Jonathan is a major key leader, theoretician, strategist, preacher, and moral activist for the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival. He's co-authored numerous articles and sermons with Reverend William Barber, including their major work, The Third Reconstruction. Just this past weekend, he co-authored a New York Times op-ed piece with Reverend Barber entitled I Can't Breathe, A Cry for Change. Jonathan's most recent book is Revolution of Values, Reclaiming Public Faith for the Common Good. He and Reverend Barber teach a course at Duke University School of Public Policy on moral fusion organizing and use poor people's movements to introduce students to critical thinking about people-led movements for social change. So, Fran and Jonathan, it is so wonderful to have you here. This is really an important, wonderful dialogue that we'll be having. And is this the first time you've met each other? It is. Okay. All right. Well, welcome. All right. Good. And it won't be the last, I know. So, Jonathan, we're in the classroom now. Okay, so here you and Reverend Barber are talking to the students, first day of class, and you're saying we're going to be using poor people's movements, right? Why
That's right. Look at your syllabus. It's on the syllabus. That's right.
All right. So here we are. We got dozens of copies in the back. So anyway, what do you start saying? What do you say we're going to do? What are we going to read? What's our concern here? What are you trying to teach these students?
First of all, let me thank you, Jim, for introducing me to my teacher, who I've only known through her writing. It's an honor to be here with you. We began teaching this course in the public policy school at Duke University, the Sanford School there, when the faculty asked if we would come as practitioners. I'm certainly no scholar, but if we would come as practitioners to introduce people who are studying public policy to moral fusion organizing. Reverend Barber, of course, introduced me to moral fusion organizing when I was still a teenager, and he learned it from his parents, who had both studied the history of how Black and white folks had organized together in the South after the Civil War and on into the 20th century, and themselves were active participants in the movement to overcome Jim Crow in the South in the 1960s and 70s. And so we have, in that context, wanted to introduce students to that history, certainly to the current movement that we are involved in, which is an attempt to practice moral fusion organizing through the Poor People's Campaign, but to do that with some tools to understand how poor people's movements have functioned over time, and the critical work that this book does on poor people's movements to point out that often we believe that we can build power by building organizations, when, as a matter of fact, movements have often been most powerful when they have disrupted the status quo, when they have interrupted things as they have been working and have demanded that things must change and work differently. So your book has been a gift to us and to the class in that way, and has really, forced these public policy students who often come with much experience, but also they want to, they want to be able to make a difference and make a change within a system, and often are tempted towards the technocratic and managerial approaches that are so often predominant in those settings. They have to grapple with the historical realities that you present in this book. So it's been a great gift to wrestle through these case studies with them. So thank you for the book. Let me just take the opportunity to say that. Thank you for the,
Well, thank you for those
not just this one, but the
words.
many you've written since then.
I want to go back to Jim's introduction to our discussion. Because, Jim, you sort of posited a kind of contradiction between work in electoral politics and the work of movements that are disrupted, that make trouble. Mm-hmm. And there are some contradictions between these two ways of doing politics, but there are also ways in which they're very complementary that I think people often don't appreciate. So what do you think of going back to that distinction that you made and mining it for meaning, for a kind of educative lesson about movements?
Well, as you point out, movements really develop out of economic conditions, much larger variables that people are under. It's not the leaders and the organizers that bring it about. And so once you have that unrest, the insurrections or the insurgencies, they often get used by politicians, by organizers. You quote Robert Michel's often. The charismatic leader is often becoming the one who is leading a bureaucratic movement. And so much of the energy, the idealism, the spontaneity comes to be channeled in that more electoral process, which often pacifies and doesn't really bring about the end game that you're looking for. Is that sort of an okay summary?
I think there's truth in that, but it isn't the whole truth. I think it's important to have the whole truth right now, because people are so activated in the United States, in Europe, in Latin America too. And people are trying to do politics. They're trying to exert power. And some of them are doing it through electoral politics by the creation, for example, of caucuses within old parties that will have a more dramatic effect, or by creating new parties. And some of them are doing it through movements. But right now, I think that there is a kind of openness between people who do movement work and the people who do electoral work, a kind of openness to appreciating the significance of both kinds of work. And I think we ought to probe that because I think it could be helpful. It is true, and I sort of grew up with this kind of talk. It is true that electoral politics can co-opt a kind of a movement that arises from the grassroots, that is insurrectionary, that doesn't follow the rules. And people who do electoral politics have a lot of rules. They have a lot of lessons. In fact, so do organizers have a lot of rules and a lot of lessons. But what is less appreciated, and right now has to be appreciated because it's happening, is the way in which electoral politics and movement politics can nourish each other. Because movement politics, it's true that it sort of rises up in a way that is almost spontaneous, or at least that organizers don't do. They don't make it rise up. It comes from the experience of the masses, of the large numbers of people who are the victims of our political economy. So there's, for a long time now, there's been the argument among organizers that movements, the spontaneity of movements is suppressed, and the distinctive kinds of power that movements can exert are wasted by the operatives who try to steer the movement into A, permanent organizing, and B, they do that in order to be effective in electoral politics. And I certainly came of age with the idea, blasted about all the time, that electoral politics co-opted the movement. It does. There is that. And we hear it even now. You shouldn't be making noise in the street. You should be, working on the doors to register people to vote. Or you should be working in the local party organization to get our views expressed by the party machinery. And raising hell in the streets is a waste of time. Now, I happen to have a lot of confidence in raising hell in the streets and raising hell in the institutions. But I do think that we can raise hell better, with more morale, with more confidence, if there are portions of our electoral political system that are oriented to what's happening in the street and are afraid of what's happening in the street. So I want to see both kinds of politics really kind of revved up and as strong and rambunctious and troublesome as they can be, because the electoral innovators, say the people from DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, or the Squad, or whatever, they will be more effective if there's trouble in the streets. The success that we've had on the left under the Biden regime, whoever thought the left would have success under a Biden regime? That's really spectacular. That success is owed to the fact that Biden had just experienced one of the strongest and most disruptive movements in American history. Black Lives Matter. I think maybe it wasn't the most disruptive. I think the labor movement was ahead of Black Lives Matter in that regard. Nevertheless, it was a big movement, and it still is there. And it's making a lot of trouble. And everybody has to pay attention to it. And Joe Biden has to pay attention to it. That makes Joe Biden a president of the left. But it's not just the electoral politics. It's the way in which that movement has created, nourished an electoral insurgency that is exemplified by people, for politicians like the Squad. I mean, they are politicians.
I think that's absolutely right. I see the role of a movement, the job of a movement, is to change the conversation about what is possible in these legislative bodies, whether it's at the local, the state, or the federal level. And what we have been doing with the Poor People's Campaign has really been about connecting with these insurgent movements where people have skin in the game, whether it's, folks whose water has been shut off in Michigan, or it's people whose land is being taken away in Arizona, or it's, poor people who have been working for far less than a living wage in the Fight for 15, shutting down the restaurants and other places where they are paid so little in order to raise the issue, to come together and to say, it is possible to put forward an agenda that could inspire and encourage these sort of folks to turn out to vote. And that has been the energy that created the momentum for the third Reconstruction Resolution, which was just introduced in the House this week, which really lays out a roadmap for how policy could address the concerns of this very broad coalition. Now, is there currently a majority of elected officials who are willing to push that policy through? No, but a movement can create the necessity for that group to exist, and I think that is the work of a movement. So I appreciate what you're saying.
No, I agree with what you're saying. Both the movement has a constituency, right? Mm-hmm. It speaks to people who feel that these leaders, these performers in the streets or in the factories or in the schools, these people think that the movement is their movement. And at the same time, elected politicians also have constituencies. Mm-hmm. These constituencies in the real world, they overlap. Mm-hmm. And because they overlap, that means that politicians also have to speak to the movement constituency.
Yeah.
And they have to worry about it. And they have to try, politicians try to build coalitions. They have to try to include the people who are riled up by the movement, who are part of the movement. They have to try to include them in the audience, in the coalition that they are trying to create. So how do they do that? Well, the politicians who are experts in rhetoric, right? That's what they do. Sometimes they also make something happen, but what they do first and foremost is spit out rhetoric. That rhetoric can be very important in encouraging the expression of anger, of grievance, and goading the movement into existence, really. Mm-hmm. So from the very from the origins of both the left-wing electoral politics and the movement politics, they have a kind of interaction with each other that affects what is happening in each sphere. When we're winning, when the street action is winning, that victory is fashioned in the legislature by politicians who run for election. Mm-hmm. They're the ones who, in a sense, realize the aspirations and the grievances and the hope of the movement. We depend on elected politicians to do that. And they do it because they're afraid of movement disruption. That works against their efforts to build wide electoral constituencies.
Jonathan, where is the role of moral fusion in this, in your organizing the prophetic tradition, trying to create the beloved community? How does that fit into what you're doing, what Fran just mentioned?
Well, the way I've come to understand the movements that have been transformative, this is something that's impacting all of us. It's a moral issue. And that raising it as a moral issue is what changes the consensus. It's what makes it possible for both Republicans and Democrats in the Congress at the time to support a Voting Rights Act, and for Lyndon Johnson to be on television in the well of the Congress there saying, we shall overcome. Right. Now, there's an example of a politician being so moved by a movement that they go on television to take up the slogan of the movement, right? But I think we often talk with folks in communities and with our students about how sometimes people want to look back and say that sort of a moral claim is something of a kind of religiosity that's in the country's past. But I think whatever your religious or moral tradition. I certainly acknowledge that, we may be a more pluralistic country than we were then, but I think people are still motivated by some sense of right and wrong that's conditioned by their value system and the traditions that they identify with, and finding a way to articulate that and to shift what is acceptable to the general public is one of the crucial goals of any movement. So that's why we say it has to be moral. We say it has to be fusion, because it has to recognize, particularly in this siloed world we live in, where people so specialize in different things, that often advocacy around a single issue is for the sake of such a small constituency that you can't build broad power for political change. And so we say it has to be fusion to the extent that people who are directly impacted by any particular issue see the way that their issue connects to the next issue and the next issue, so that you can build a coalition that is able to say, as we're saying, that, you can be touched in different ways by poverty and inequality in this country, but there are 140 million people who are poor or low income. That's 43% of the country. If those people organize and get together, the politicians have to listen to them. That's a constituency.
I appreciate the basis of this, the kind of appeal that you're describing, because we all do share a culture that has moral precepts. And I think that those moral precepts can sometimes be tapped and be significant in politics, even in street politics. I also think, however, that movements divide people, and we should not be afraid of that. We should not be afraid of the divisive impact of our movements, because we're often threatened, scolded for creating division because we're making too much noise. We're making too much trouble. And in fact, noise and trouble are some of the tools of a movement. Movements do divide people. We have to, in some ways, we have to be divided, because there are a lot of bad people, selfish people, rich people, greedy people, lying people out there that we have to overwhelm with the force of our movement.
I'm a Baptist preacher, and I'm often telling people in the church, we don't like to remember some of the things that Jesus said. Jesus said, "I didn't come to bring peace, but to bring a sword." And the point he was making, I take, is exactly the point you're making. Sometimes the truth cuts, and when it cuts, it divides, those who are in the wrong versus everyone else. And you got to decide which side you're on. So I agree. Any moral movement has to make some moral claims, which means it will necessarily be divisive. And which side are you on? The Union folks used to sing, right?
Yeah.
Which side are you on?
And they still sing it.
Yeah. I'm curious, Jonathan, how do your students respond to this discussion? You mentioned that many of them are looking for technocratic answers. And when you're throwing this sort of material at them, how do they respond? How have they responded?
Well, I will say that I'm incredibly impressed by students these days in terms of whereas even, over and against 10 years ago, the folks I'm interacting with are in a place where they recognize that we cannot go on as we have. And I think that is a generational moment that we're in. It's hard to read the signs of the time and to understand, exactly when you can build enough of a consensus to get major structural change. I don't know that any of us decide when those things happen, but it is clear to me that there is an increasing consensus, particularly among young people, that they have been welcomed into, they have inherited a system that is so broken that it doesn't work for most of them. And I think often they recognize it doesn't work for them as an individual. Like they can't imagine a future within the system when they think about, just their own lives in terms of the debt that they've acquired and the opportunities they have for housing and for wages and for any number of things. It's not about other people, it's about them. They recognize that this system doesn't work for them. And so I think there's an increased desire to reflect on how change has happened in the past and how it can happen now.
Are you finding the same thing, Francis, with some of the young people you're interacting with?
Yeah, I think that one of the most striking things, given American history, is that young white people are very open to alliances with people of color. They're in the streets for Black Lives Matter, for example. And they're in the streets for every police brutality. And I think that has to do with aspects of their social world, their culture, the culture of music and the culture of sports that, my generation was not as exposed to as the young people are today. But they are much more open to a kind of multiracial movement that reaches across very familiar barriers. That's a new thing, and it could be very important.
Yeah.
I often think one of my teachers and mentors in this movement work was Vincent Harding, who was a historian. And Vincent used to always remind us, he would say, remember, this is a very young multi-ethnic democracy. He said, we've only attempted it for part of my life. This is a very young multi-ethnic democracy. And so I think the crucial work of this third Reconstruction moment that we're living in is the work of structuring in law and in cultural practice what it looks like to share just what you're saying that young people are trying to figure out, to share life in such a way that whiteness is not considered the norm, right? That it's not the assumption that the white folks are right and that everybody else will have to get along with them if they're going to be part of the society. A multi-ethnic democracy has to look across its law and across its norms to ask, how can we imagine the society such that it could work for everyone? And it seems to me that's the moment we're in.
I think so too. And I think in a way that slowly building up change in the United States and in the culture, especially in the culture of the young, creates new possibilities that have not been there before. So, and do you know where I look with amazement? I look at advertising. Now, these are the people who want to make money by selling crap. So,
yeah.
So, and how are they trying to make money?
Yeah.
They show interracial couples,
Right.
Children in interracial families. What? This is a reality in America, and who is telling us about it? Madison Avenue.
Yeah.
It's kind of incredible.
And within such a very short time, this is happening. This has happened. Absolutely.
Well, a short time or a long time? I think it's a long time. I think it's an appallingly long time.
No, I know. I understand that. I mean, just a short time that we've now opened up this this sort of viewpoint from Madison Avenue. Yeah. So, I'm looking on the first your chapter here, the structuring of protest, and this sentence jumps out at me. Organizers and leaders cannot prevent the ebbing of protest, nor the erosion of whatever influence protest yielded the lower class. They can only try to win whatever can be won while it can be won. What do you want to comment on that, or is that changed now at this point, or?
Well, it's a kind of sober point of view, if not gloomy point of view, but it argues that when all hell breaks loose, when people are marching in the streets, when they're taking over the factories or taking over the schools or taking over the tenements, which that's the next big fight in the United States. When this is happening, there are always people who come in from sort of the side and say, oh, we have to demand A, B, C, D, E. That those are the correct demands to make. Well, two things. You have to demand what people really care about, what really is inspiring their daredevil challenges in the streets and in the schools and in the factories. But the other thing is that at that point in time, when elites have to do something, they're going to try to do what works for them.
Yeah.
So you have to be aware that that's going to happen, and try to get as much from this moment of conciliation and vulnerability that they are expressing, get as much as you can for people below, people on the bottom. Now, there are always going to be utopians and who think that we should never settle for anything less than our vision, but we always do.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's important to remember history this way too, to see that the demands of the past are often forgotten in the way we celebrate victories, right? We have all these memorials and commemorations. We celebrate the March on Washington, and every news network hits the "I Have a Dream" speech, and people say, "Well, oh, isn't it great that the black and white folks are together in the Coca-Cola commercials now?" But the demands of the March on Washington weren't simply that segregation should end, but that there should be a basic living wage. It was a march for jobs and justice. And so we often say, that the current demand for 15 an hour, the fight for 15, is exactly what they were asking for with inflation in 1963. And so it's a way in which we can't forget that history. When we look back and celebrate these moments, we have to remember to push now for what wasn't gained then, because the need for it has remained.
And your comments, I think, remind us how long and hard the struggles are for whatever is won to make the United States a more humane country. We are in this country right now fighting to protect the right to vote. That should be so mind-boggling. The right to vote was the animating issue of the Revolutionary War mobs. The right to vote was the animating issue of the new birth of freedom, the abolitionist movement after the Civil War. The right to vote was the animating issue of the civil rights movement. Not only are we still fighting for the right to vote, but capitalist elites in politics are actively working to smash that right, to take it back. I don't know.
And what we can't overlook that the energy behind their extreme measures is a direct backlash against the increased engagement, in particular of poor and young people in this last election. Right? It's a surge. I think the uprising last summer had something to do with the surge. I think the 4 years of protest against Trump had something to do with it. I think a lot of different groups doing grassroots organizing had something to do with it. But there was this surge, this sense that people wanted to get involved with the government. People wanted to see change. They turn out to vote. And what is the reaction of people, particularly Republicans and state legislatures across the country? The immediate reaction is, let's make it more difficult to vote. So in some ways, the extremism of the action ought to be a confirmation to the movement of our power, right? If they have to go to such extremes, then recognize that when we do show up, it can make a difference.
I agree with that. Although I find it sort of breathtaking that conservative elites in the United States would so openly go after the right to vote. Everybody knows what they're doing. I mean, denying the results of a presidential election, demanding multiple recounts by uncertified people. I mean,
well, what's behind?
Amazing moment.
Yeah, it is. It's their judgment that this is the only thing they can do to maintain their power.
That's right.
To divide and conquer and to appeal to the worst in us.
And for those who dismiss electoral politics, notice how much weight Republican and business organizers place on electoral politics, because that's what they're trying to get control of. They think it's important. That's a clue to us. That's
true. Yeah, they don't have the people, but they have the resources that they're trying to control through the electoral policies. I would just wonder, Francis, what are some of your thoughts as you've observed the Poor People's Campaign and Jonathan and Reverend Barbara and so many others in their struggles? What are your feelings about that? And I'm talking about does it remind you of some of the struggles you, Richard, were involved in? What's your take?
Well, I think it's hard to begin a movement with poor people. The reason is that poverty is a mark of shame in America and American culture. People don't want to come forward demanding their rights because they're poor. It takes a lot for that to happen. It did happen to a considerable extent in the late 1960s. But notice that then people coming forward because they were poor were not the first to come forward. They followed in a way in the footsteps of the Black freedom movement. That gave them courage and gave them a kind of moral authority. It's also why I think Jonathan's remarks are important when he talks about raising the moral issues that are embedded in all of the issues that we raise, about housing, about employment, about poverty. Those are all moral issues, and we should speak about them as moral issues. And that, if we succeed in doing that, I think we will contribute to what is already emerging as a kind of moral agenda of poor people, as well as the liberal middle class who are always there. So we need to accept that it takes time to build the poor people's movement. And we need to keep on working at it, because movements are not, we often think about movements as short-term explosions, and they're not. The great movements of American history have been long-term movements. Look at the labor movement. Look at the Black freedom movement. The Black freedom movement began before the Civil War. So it takes time. We have to keep exerting whatever pressure we can. And one more thing that I think is so important for movement organizers, and that is that people do have power. They can really screw things up. They can stop the traffic. They can stop the factory. They can shut down the school. But these sources of power are not what's written about in the textbooks. It's not what their ministers talk to them about. They have to rediscover those sources of power again and again and again. And they do. They do.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that takes work, and that takes patience,
Mm-hmm.
and that takes faith.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are either of you concerned about possible violent neo-fascist resistance to this? I mean, we've
Oh,
seen
yeah.
some,
I
of
think
course, right. So
American politics, we're at a very unstable and, in a way, scary moment,
yeah.
because what the Trump presidency and his campaigns made evident is that there was a large constituency out there in the American public that was attracted by machismo, cruelty, racism. Those were the appeals of Trump and the Trumpites. And that's fascism. And it's here. Those people are with us. They live among us. And we have to overwhelm them. And I think we can, but they are dangerous.
And I think it's important, when we were talking about the moral foundation of movements, I think it's important to recognize that in the organizing on the extreme right, they've also claimed a moral narrative, right? They've given this crowd a narrative in which they can believe themselves righteous even when they use violence to try to overthrow the government. I mean, if you look closely at not just what was said on January 6th by the people who were there, but what has been said since then by the folks who called them to come, and by the people who are defending themselves for being there, they very much understand themselves to be the sort of last guard against some terrible and immoral thing that's going to overthrow the nation as they understand it. That's a moral narrative, and to me it's strikingly similar to the language of the redemption era, when preachers here in the South went to white people and told them that black folks involved in politics were corrupting the society and the morality of the society, and that they had a moral obligation to use any means necessary to reclaim their power. I think that it's another reason why we have to have a moral narrative to oppose it, because it really is a sort of contention about what not just what the nation should be, but what people's fundamental identity should be. And that's a power struggle that's very much being played out. So I do not just worry about violence. I see violence. It's happening.
Do you debate and dialogue with some of these people, Jonathan, as a Baptist preacher?
Well, I'm not looking for street fights by any means. I mean, I am a preacher, and I know people who genuinely wrestle with this, because within the church, the story I tell in the book Revolution of Values is how for 40 years there's been a campaign to flood churches with propaganda that essentially has told people that to be Christian is to be allied with capitalism and with right-wing politics in this country. They've called it biblical values over and against what the Bible actually says. So I completely understand that, well-meaning people who've just shown up in churches have been misled. And I do engage people about what they have believed, what the scriptures actually say, and what we need to grapple with in terms of going forward. But no, I don't think that a confrontation in terms of the street fights and the culture war issues that are being brought up, I don't think engaging in that is the way to win the battle. I think the way to win is to build the kind of coalition that can make real in a sense, make real the world that they've been taught to fear. And when they see a different kind of society, I think people will realize that what they've been told is a lie, and that the only transformation that's possible is a systemic transformation that then invites people to engage with a new reality. That's my hope in terms of moving forward. I think some people can be won over that way. Of course, some people will still fight and resist it. But I think we have the possibility for a majority that is willing to go in a very different direction.
It's a great way of putting
I
it.
think it's possible to see Joe Biden's strategy as, in a way, linked to your comments, that people have to see the reality of an alternative politics. Because what's been striking about Biden's very short term as a president is the haste with which he has inaugurated very big programs that could be very important in relieving the worst need in the United States. The child tax credit, for example, or the amount of effort and money that has been put into making the vaccine available. It's like he's saying to himself, I don't know what he says to himself, but it's as though he says to himself, given the fact that everybody is flooded with propaganda and with lies, let's show them something concrete and material that will improve their lives. That seems to be what he's doing. And that's a good thing to do.
It is amazing because I must admit here, you probably remember this, Johnson. You had Biden and a number of other candidates appear before the Poor People's Campaign. I think it was last summer, or whenever. And what we heard from him as he came up to give his talk, which was very fast, and he just sort of left very quickly, that this wasn't his. That's what I heard him say. This wasn't my group. So isn't it amazing, doubly amazing, as Fran is pointing out, that he has reached out and is promoting the sort of policies that are making very progressive differences.
Well, I don't think it's a personal thing. I mean, this brother's a career politician. He's learned how to respond to the constituencies that shape his electorate, and our goal is to change that. So, to the extent that we have, I think he has to respond.
Don't forget, the Black Lives Matter movement was really big, and it still is there. And yes, if you look closely at his rhetoric and at his actions, he's paying attention to that movement.
Absolutely.
That's a great point.
First president to ever address the Congress and talk about white supremacy. We've never heard that from a president.
Absolutely. That's a great point to end on. And so what do you think? Will Frances be giving a lecture in the course? She can zoom in. What do you think?
Would be a delight.
I think it'd be terrific.
Wonderful to engage with you.
It was great,
Jim.
Yeah,
it was terrific. I'm so glad that we could do this. It was just terrific. And again, I thank you so very, very much for this terrific, terrific dialogue. And this is Jim Vrettos again here from the Radical Imagination. We look forward to seeing you again next week on the Radical Imagination.